Okay, let's start. So part 4, Dickens, England. Welcome everyone who's with us tonight. Glad you can be here. And tonight we'll be focusing on Victorian women. So a little background here, Victorian women and the law. Back in 1769, a long time ago, Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England were a foundational document, a big, thick document. And it covered pretty much all the law that Parliament was going to operate from, and so would leadership. And they cover coverture. And just a quote here: the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during her marriage, or at least is incorporated or consolidated into that of her husband, under whose wing, protection, and cover she performs everything. Essentially boiled down to 3 bullet points. A woman surrendered her legal existence upon marrying. Control of income from a woman's real property passed under the common law to her husband. Think of Cora in Downton Abbey. You know, when she, and I did a whole course on that prior to these. She, of course, as a wealthy American woman, came over and saved Downton Abbey with all her money. And then if you followed all the years, you know that at one point when they weren't going to have an heir, there was fear that, you know, the money was going to dissipate. And that's all because of coverture as outlined here in Blackstone. And finally, she could part with personal property, but only with his consent. So if she had a beautiful diamond ring or something, and she wanted to give to whomever, she had to ask for permission to even do something like that. So it wasn't all about just real estate and the big bank account. Social mores for middle-class women, and I use the term middle-class women here a bit more broadly. We'll be narrowing that down more and more as we go along here. Women were seen as pure and clean. Their bodies were seen as temples that should not be decorated with jewelry nor used for physical activities or pleasurable sex. Could not oppose men. Single women were pitied. The main purpose for women was to marry and reproduce. Lower middle class women could work, and they worked ages 8 to 12 and then stopped when they got married. Even if their income would still be needed for the family. Think Bob Cratchit, for instance. That's definitely lower middle class. And she didn't work. Upwardly mobile women married for economic and or social gain. Dowries dictated the type of man a woman could marry. No women could vote, and women were unable to be a legal guardian for their own children. Now, this is going to, you know, this course goes to 1849. Things are going to begin to evolve in a better way for women. Late 1850s on, but of course they're not going to get to vote for quite a long time. But there'll be more and more pressure. But in the time frame we are, there is not much pressure at all. Not even the Chartists. There were some Chartists who embraced women's rights, but they were divided too. An important book, and I'm getting out of my dates here, but I did it on purpose, and I'll explain. Street Life in London is an important book. It was published in 1877, so even actually after Dickens' death. But it is a photographic record, and there's a beautiful, cheap, I think under $10 paperback version available on Amazon of this, with amazing collection. This is just I show you 3 in this set of slides. And it's absolutely, and why I broke my rule of going past 49 was because these are absolutely the scenes that Dickens saw on his walks. So even though it's 77, and there really wasn't much in the way of photography yet. By 49, Dickens saw these scenes. So you have flower girls on the left, and you have strawberry sellers. These are women who, for the most part, are of the working class hierarchy. And here's a quote from one of Dickens's sketches. The appearance presented by the streets of London an hour before sunrise on a summer's morning is most striking even to the few whose unfortunate pursuits of pleasure or scarcely less unfortunate pursuits of business cause them to be well acquainted with the scene. I think this is the most powerful image in the whole collection. This woman was known as a crawler, meaning she was a homeless person. She was here babysitting a working class woman who couldn't take her baby or into work. And so this woman was sitting outside the workplace or nearby, babysitting for the entire time that the mother was working. Here's a quote from the book. Huddled together on the workhouse steps in Short's gardens, those wrecks of humanity, the crawlers of St. Giles, may be seen both day and night seeking mutual warmth and mutual consolation in their extreme misery. As a rule, they are old women reduced by vice and poverty to that degree of wretchedness which destroys even the energy to beg. Fallen Women, powerful political cartoon, contemporary for the time. Here's a prostitute seen, in skeletal form. Why? Because she has syphilis or some other disease due to her business. And on the right is a cartoon, again, from the time, from Punch magazine, which had burst on the scene in the 40s. And it's about prostitution as well. So 1 in 5 Londoners, approximately, contracted syphilis by age 35 in 1800. It's pretty high. If you could afford it, mercury was the standard treatment. Nice if you could afford it, but on the other hand, not so good to put mercury in your body. Service was what a large number of the lower class women worked at. These are contemporary to the time. There was a tax on indoor male servants, and their wages were considerably higher. So only the wealthy could afford to employ them. Women servants were cheap and generally more easily dominated and kept in their place. And so we're talking about approximately 25% of the population, which was high. So, service is the number one employer, period, men and women, in England and elsewhere in the empire, through Downton Abbey. If you follow Downton Abbey, it's not till the last couple years that the service, of course, is beginning to diminish, and that's because they couldn't afford it anymore. Plus, others didn't want to be in service any longer, and they show that to you in Downton Abbey too. Factory work, of course, is the new source of work. More than 50% of all factory workers were women under the age of 20, and most of them worked in the textile mills. And of course, textiles was the number one exporter for England at this time, particularly in the first half of their so-called era of industrial revolution. Now, the proper middle class woman. We see change over time, even within the scope of this course. Classic photograph of a middle class woman and her role as a provider of family, and fairly modest conservative dress for what level of income she would probably have been at. I couldn't, plus there's of course no color photographs. This is illustration best, I think, shows how over time more the nouveau riche, who are coming in to wealth and who are going to bump up from kind of middle class to upper middle class, how they're going to dress. They're not going to have as many children, and they're lavish. So change over time, always an important theme in any history class.
Hey, Kendall.
Yes.
This is Karen. Can you go back to that picture?
Sure.
I believe that is actually Queen Alexandra, the wife of Edward VII.
Very good.
And wow. And that's, if you look to the right, that's George. That will become George V.
Right there. Yeah, I can see it.
Anyway, not to interrupt.
No, not at all. Thank you.
Not so much middle class.
So
this was not. She was not middle class, although she really was not extravagant, according to what I've read.
Correct. And still representative, but absolutely staying corrected. That gets a table slap.
It got one.
Yeah. So from both of us, and I'm not one who gives one out. They're a very good call, but it's still representative of kind of solid upper middle class who are providing babies.
Kendall, you have a question in the chat from Marianne. She says, what would be considered proper middle class and what would the occupation be?
Well, no occupation for a woman. And a man of the proper middle class is going to be a lawyer of higher standing, or most often a merchant of a good neighborhood and sizable, and probably ships other places as well.
Kendall,
newspaper editors. Pardon me?
Would Harry be solidly middle class?
From our twist. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Table slap. That's a good one. That's a good one, Doc.
Oh, please,
yeah,
please.
A good example. Well, you don't get many, so I have to give you
I admit that.
Okay. So yes, that would be a good example from our novel. So women of the aristocracy. And notice the change in dress on the right, here, and this is a period painting of the time we're talking about. The idle rich were the landowners who rented out their large holdings, and women were assured large dowries. Time was spent between several estates and the court. Developed and maintained philanthropic projects, funded the construction of churches. That was always the number one thing the wealthy were doing, and maintained upkeep of their estates. And again, this usually fell in the hands of women. Socialized exclusively within the aristocracy, and marriage was pursued for political and economic gains. Notice in a previous slide for middle class, I was talking about for economic or social gains. There's no social gain here. They're aristocrats. Now later on, in the late 1800s, then it kind of matters because so many aristocrats are running out of money, but not here at this time frame. And of course, if we talked about affairs and Victorian principles and all that, men openly had their affairs, and that was okay if they did, but as long as you didn't get caught in a scandal. And women, the same thing, because you weren't marrying for love at this level, particularly in the mid 1800s. It just, that doesn't mean there weren't some, but not too many. But you didn't want to get caught. Queen Victoria. So let's talk about some real people now. She commissions Sir Robert Peel, who we talked about last time, to form a new government. He, the Tory, the conservative, who believes in improving the lot of those who are working in horrible conditions. He's the one who will push for the repeal of the Corn Laws, even though it goes against the kind of people that he supposedly represents. She'll marry Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Goth in 1840, if you've seen Victoria. And a child, her first child of quite a handful, will be born in the same year. So things happened fast there, but nothing suspicious. Throughout the 1840s, I just summarized some things here. Privately attempted to influence government policy. She raised eyebrows here, and the show Victoria kind of gets at this a little bit. And that was something that monarchs by now, particularly a woman, was really not supposed to do, and goes against the grain. She becomes an instant sensation almost in England. She'll be identified as a mother. She'll be identified as one who has strict personal morals and exemplifies those. And it's because of her, we get the term, when you talk about Victorian principles and mores and how strict and sexless things were, which of course is not true, but that was a character that comes out of Victoria. And some were truly like that, but not all that many. And she produces quite a family. Albert, 41, Alice in 43, Alfred in 44, Helena in 46, Louise in 48, and then 3 more in the 50s. And of course, in another course I'll teach next year, a number of those babies are going to be important players in what happens at the turn of the century and World War I. She's going to survive 3 assassination attempts in this decade. That's not good, and shows you the volatility even within England. And as I mentioned before, supports the Corn Law repeal. So let's talk about Dickens' women. From Oliver Twist: my heart is set as firmly as ever heart of man was set on woman. I have no thought, no view, no hope in life beyond her. And if you oppose me in this great stake, you take my peace and happiness in your hands and cast them to the wind. So Elizabeth Barrow Dickens, his mom, upon being dismissed from the Marshalsea for debt, John insisted that Oliver leave the blacking factory, though Elizabeth wanted him to stay. Charles Dickens never forgave his mother for her opposition to him returning to school, and instead keep providing cash to his parents. She had as much trouble with money as her husband did. The author would use his mother as the inspiration for Mrs. Nickleby, who Dickens creates to be an absurdly vain, grotesquely self-centered, self-satisfied, and very able giver of bad advice. And the last novel I'll talk about in 2 weeks, in our last session, Dombey and Son, truly one of his great novels. A quote: "Not an orphan in the wide world can be so deserted as the child who is an outcast from a living parent's love." As I've said before, there's so many things that are autobiographical in Dickens's writing. He reveals so much about himself in his novels, once you know the backstory. His wife, Catherine Hogarth Dickens, eldest daughter of 10 children. Her father, George Hogarth, was a successful writer and music critic for the Morning Chronicle, and later become editor of the Evening Chronicle, which was one of the big newspapers for the London area. Charles and Catherine were married in 1836. He had just put out 3 days before his wedding the first issue of Pickwick Papers. And it was because of the contract he secured for Pickwick that led him to ask Catherine for her hand in marriage, because he felt that financial stability was coming. Catherine was pregnant 9 out of 14 of their first years of marriage, ultimately bearing Dickens 10 children. And she would accompany Charles on his first trip to the United States in 1842, having just given birth. And she was not happy about leaving her children behind. She wanted to bring them, and Charles said no. So if you were in my other class, and you've seen this map before, 1842, this is his first of 2 visits to the United States. He would arrive in Boston, head south as far as Richmond, then back up into Pennsylvania and west to St. Louis, and then up through the Great Lakes regions into Canada to Quebec, and then back home. He used steamship, steamboat, canal, railroad, stagecoach. Hated the stagecoach. This was quite a sojourn and quite an eye-opener for him. Here's the first photograph ever taken of Charles Dickens was taken in the United States, actually in Baltimore. So that's what he looks like really at this time we're talking. Observations from the American Notes. He would get home and write the book American Notes, not in separate pieces, but as one published book. Dickens had imagined that his trip would reveal what he had long envisioned, an American Idol. He visited and examined schools, libraries, hospitals, and prisons, among other institutions. Everywhere he was toasted and feted to the point that he grew tired of the adoration. He thought it was awesome at first, but about halfway through, he was done, and he tried to hide, but he couldn't hide because everybody knew what he looked like. He expressly wanted to address international copyright law, knowing full well that he had not made a shilling with all of his publications in the US. He was criticized in the New York Times for acting like a tradesman. When the Dickenses returned home, he published his American Notes, which proved to sell poorly in England and made enemies in the United States. Quote, "The people are all alike. There's no diversity of character. They travel about on the same errands, say and do the same things in exactly the same manner, and follow in the same dull, cheerless round." That's not the America I know. Even Thomas Nast is going to pick up on the American Notes. One of my favorite pieces in American Notes. He writes, "As Washington may be called the headquarters of tobacco-tinctured saliva, the time has come when I must confess without any disguise that the prevalence of those 2 odious practices of chewing and expectorating began about this time to be anything but agreeable and soon became most offensive and sickening." And Nast, wanting to make a critical point about the government, will use that information to draw the United States as the national spittoon. Mary Hogarth, a very interesting person in his life. Younger sister to Catherine Hogarth Dickens, came to live with the Dickenses in their first small apartment and then moved with them to Doughty Street. This was a common practice to take your next oldest sister once you got married with you, so you would teach her the ways of how to be a married woman. Dickens showed particular affection to Hogarth. No implication here that there was anything going on behind anybody's back, and described her as, quote, "a close friend, an exceptional sister, a companion at home." He did have her read all of his first drafts of Oliver Twist, because at this point, he's finishing up Pickwick. He's about halfway through, and he's starting Oliver Twist. Crazy. Hogarth dies suddenly in what was determined to be a heart attack in 1837. She died in Dickens's arms.
Oh.
Dickens was devastated. He took one of the rings off her fingers, and he wore it for the rest of his life, never taking it off his hand, as far as we know. And then kind of the weirdest part, he refused to have her clothes discarded and was known to take them out and lay them out on the bed where she died and look at them from time to time. So needless to say, there was a psychic connection here. Then finally, Angela Burdett Coutts was one of the wealthiest women in England when she inherited her grandfather's fortune of about 1.8 million pounds, which was a lot of money back then. Charles Dickens merged his fame with Burdett Coutts's wealth and served as her official almoner and helped to assess the merits of the thousands of letters she received from those seeking financial assistance, beginning in 1840 for the rest of his life. Together, their first joint venture would be to create Urania Cottage, which is photographed in the lower left-hand corner. And it was a home for fallen women. Throughout her life, she donated most of her wealth for worthwhile projects. And a contemporary said this about Coutts, Burdett Coutts. This is not Dickens. She never thought she was done when it came to helping people, and she wasn't motivated in any way by a desire for fame or glory. Quite the opposite. She often made donations anonymously. To twist, Nancy. From Twist, a quote, Nancy, apparently fearful of irritating the housebreaker, sat with her eyes fixed upon the fire as if she had been deaf to all that passed. And of course, she's referencing Bill Sykes there. Then these two quotes comes from Michael Slater, who's one of the top living biographers of Dickens today. And this is from an earlier work, Dickens and Women. Nancy is the only character in whose portrayal Dickens seems to be seeking to explore a conception of female nature itself rather than simply presenting aspects of it. For Nancy, personal relations take precedence over most other considerations, and her horrible death is the direct result of efforts to save the child she pities and yet stay loyal to the man she loves. And the mystery of her unswerving devotion to the brutish man who is in every way her inferior fascinates Dickens and inspires him to develop her into the only one of his early female characters that can be taken seriously. And of course, this is an important moment in the novel where Nancy's showing herself.
Hey, Kendall, you have a question in the chat.
Yep.
It says, was Dickens, this is from Jennifer, was Dickens raised lower middle class? His father was imprisoned and Charles had to quit school. His writing made him upwardly mobile, but he could never be a member of the aristocracy. So was he considered middle or upper middle class after his fame?
Oh, after his fame, he was absolutely upper middle class, wealthy upper middle class. But he was lower middle class. His father was a Navy clerk, Clark, if you want to be British here. And if he hadn't overspent his money, he wouldn't have sunk into debt and been in prison. But, you know, and he afforded at first to be able to send Charles and one of his sisters to school. But that all fell apart because, and I'm not going to get into it, it's well documented. If you want to read a biography, you can read about his spendthrift father. He couldn't manage to live on what he had. He reached beyond what he could afford. But Dickens absolutely was a very rich man by really shortly after this course ends. Once we get to Copperfield, which is in the next course. Good question. So you've seen this slide before. I'm bringing them back. Nancy and Rose, interesting because it crosses classes, which Dickens thought you could do in real life to help the unfortunate. And so Rose really exhibits, one of Dickens's important beliefs. I won't read the slide again.
Kendall?
Yes.
I was reading that. Who did that illustration? That's not Cruikshank.
No, it is not Cruikshank. This is a illustration from, I believe, well, it's either 1888 or the 1910 edition. So post Dickens, but there are 4 important rounds of publishing his novels, and those 3 other rounds had used other illustrators. So
It's interesting because I was, if I get one more damn, I'm going to throw the phone at the wall. One of the critics who I was reading about Dickens' characterizations of women said the problem with Cruikshank was that he could not draw a beautiful woman. It was incapable. They all were dumpy looking, you know.
Yeah.
And this obviously is very different from the
Yes.
Cruikshank.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Yes. When you see some of the, once we get to the next course and some of the illustrators, and his favorite being Fizz, Phiz,
Yeah.
which is a nickname. Yeah, the illustrations get better. Yeah, Cruikshank was of a different, earlier style.
Yeah.
Good point. Thank you. Table slap.
Wow. Whoa, two.
Yeah. That don't expect any more.
I don't know. That's probably it.
Yeah. So Rose Maylie. You know, a lot of people, you know, read Twist and they go, wow, what a boring person. How's she important? And actually she is important to the novel. Once you get the backstory and figure it all out. Dickens intended the last paragraph in Twist to be an elegy to Mary Hogarth. Remember that name? Woman who died in his arms, sister-in-law. He rejected Cruikshank's original fireside plate, which you see on the left, because it was too painful a reminder of the familial relationship Dickens had with Mary Hogarth before her untimely death. So Cruikshank was not happy, but Dickens said, you got to redraw this. I want something else. And he came up with Rose and Oliver standing in the church looking at the tablet on the wall. She was not past 17, cast in so slight and exquisite a mold, so mild and gentle, so pure and beautiful. The earth seemed not her element, not its rough creatures, her fit companions. Again, Dickens is writing about Rose, but really he's writing about Mary Hogarth. Again, another autobiographical thing. And he's still suffering from her death at this point. So what do we know? I didn't fill this in on purpose. I think if we have time, we'll fill this in ourselves through the conversation with Doc. So Peter, I turn it over to you.
Okay. Hey, everybody. So I've got 3 poems for you today. So get them out. And again, as always, I offer the opportunity for somebody to read them. The first one is called Jenny. It was written in 1847, but not published then, published later. And it's by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who was one of the founders of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. And they are my absolute favorite painters. This is one of his, I realized that I always get a calendar of Pre-Raphaelite women. I mean, it'd be a little weird, but that's what I do. So here is, can you see this picture?
Kind of. That's too close.
All right. All right. Well, anyway, check out the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood because of their name.
I'll type it in the thing.
Okay. Were founded in 1848, and they were especially known for and admired for their very, very vivid colors, the sense of detail that was almost, that some say was photographic, and their sensuality. And they were reacting to what they felt was the more mechanical nature of Raphael. So they are pre-Raphaelites. And he lived from 1828 to 1882. The Pre-Raphaelites often wrote with classical themes, but at the same time, they very much dealt from time to time with current issues. So the poem Jenny is about a prostitute. And Rossetti is thought to have known quite a few prostitutes. He was the lover to several of his models, married one of them. And importantly, his sister was Christina Rossetti. And she wrote one of the most controversial poems of the Victorian period called Goblin Market. Now, it was written after our time period. It was written in the 1860s. And what it was a cautionary tale about these two innocent girls, idyllic farm girls, who were attracted by what they call the goblin men, what Rossetti calls the goblin men. And these weren't exactly men, but they were highly sexualized males. So the poem, through the voices of the two girls, is to one of them, Laura, falls prey. The other one, Lizzie, saves her. And at the end, there's this great line about the sisterhood, about how they don't need men. But here's the thing. And Christina Rossetti worked with prostitutes. She was involved in charitable endeavors with, at places like the Urania Cottage. But so was and she was highly religious. But I have to tell you that, and I don't know whether my former scholars were ones who actually read Goblin Market with me, but this was one of the most famous lines of it. Remember, this is a cautionary tale about resisting temptation. So Lizzie is about to embrace Laura after Laura has escaped the goblins. She cried, Laura, up the garden, did you miss me? Come and kiss me. Never mind my bruises. Hug me, kiss me, suck my juices. Squeezed from goblin fruits for you. Goblin pulp and goblin dew. Eat me, drink me, love me. Laura, make much of me. For your sake, I have braved the glen and had to do with goblin merchant men. When I taught it, I would have the kids recite it because it is a ballad. I could sing it, but I will not. And of course, it's divided into stanzas. And it was revelatory to see the reactions of my Germantown Academy scholars, because they knew they were going to read it aloud. And some of them placed themselves at the Harkness table, knowing which number this particular stanza was, so that they could, in fact, read it. Others, of a more demure nature, would deliberately not sit where it was thought the reader of those lines would be. But you see, this is like a perfect example of like deconstructionism. She's saying all of this to her sister, like, love me because I've saved you from the goblins. And the language is so unbelievably sexualized that you're in this state of ambivalence. And there's a kind of ambivalence too in the poem Jenny. Okay, and Jenny, is there anybody who'd like to read it, or I'll be glad to. Give you about 4 seconds. Nobody's going to read it. Okay, I will. Lazy, laughing, languid Jenny, fond of a kiss and fond of a guinea, whose head upon my knee tonight rests for a while, as if grown light. With all our dances and the sound to which the wild tune spun you round, fair Jenny mine, the thoughtless queen of kisses, which the blush between could hardly make much daintier, whose eyes are as blue skies, whose hair is countless gold incomparable, fresh flowers scarce, touched with signs that tell of love's exuberant hotbed. Nay, poor flower left torn since yesterday, until tomorrow leave you bare. Poor handful of bright spring water flung in the whirlpool's shrieking face. Poor shameful Jenny, full of grace, thus with your head upon my knee, whose person or whose purse may be the lodestar of your reverie. Okay, so go back to it, do some, circle some words, circle some phrases, and then think about this question. How does the speaker show a kind of ambivalence or dual attitude towards Jenny, who he's observing sleeping?
I'm sorry, Doc, could you repeat the question? It got really loud in here. I apologize. Sorry.
Okay, that's all right. Yeah. How do we see the speaker? I mean, there's one big break in the poem, right? What's the break? Anybody? What's the place where we're stopped dead and we have to
Nay.
The word nay.
nay, the word nay. Excellent. Okay. So what I'm asking, Liz, is what are these dual views of Jenny from the point of view of the speaker? This is a much longer poem. It's almost impossible to find a short poem written by a Victorian. I mean, they just couldn't do it. So are you all thinking about the question?
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like the kind of not typical, but general like dual thing of, the angel and the whore. She's like perfect in a lot of ways, and she's also purchasable. So she's either, it's like no middle ground.
That was slap, girl. Yeah, I think that's very much the point. By the way, the angel in the house was I thought of taking a little piece of it to share with you guys. It's just so bad. Oh my God. And it's so long. I couldn't get through it. And I realize now that when I was in undergraduate and graduate school, people would refer to it, but they'd never read it. It's that bad. But the idea is, the angel and the whore. And by the way, that poem was written by Coventry Patmore, who was very opinionated about relationships between men and women. And I'm convinced that Mrs. Patmore in Downton Abbey was that they had her in mind. Seriously. So anyway, tell me what you see. Anybody, spit it out.
Fond of a kiss and fond of a guinea. That's basically showing the dual role of the prostitute. She pretends to give you love and affection, but really she's there for the money. It's her job.
Okay.
Or like right around your name, you've got the fresh flower scarce touched versus the poor flower left torn.
Okay, the contrast, right?
Yeah,
very
right
close
there.
to each other. Excellent. Okay.
There's a contrast between he's admiring her and also pitying her.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, his admiration is pretty significant, right?
But he's also judging her. He's also judging her.
Yeah, so
Excellent.
when he says the blush between could hardly make much daintier, does that mean she's wearing too much rouge that he can't even tell when she's blushing from his kisses?
I think it does.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah. So in other words, there's that ambiguity is really in both parts of the poem, although the nay really pushes us to the other side. What about what comes after the nay? I had to look up the word lodestar. You know what lodestar is?
It's a
It's-
guiding star. It's like the North
Yeah.
Star.
Yes. It's
But it
like
can-
the North Star.
But it can also be a person who is your guide.
Yep.
excellent, or an inspiration.
A muse.
Listen to you. All right. Yeah, absolutely. So in those last lines of the selection, what particular words strike you?
Shrieking.
What is a whirlpool's shrieking face? I mean, I'm not saying I know this. I'm just asking.
I have no idea.
How do you imagine it? What would it be?
How about a toilet?
Well,
Eric, you never cease to surprise me. Okay.
I'm thinking of like Monk's The Scream, but sort of like a,
Oh,
face.
oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, the idea is that there's this nice spring water, right? But it's flung in the whirlpool's shrieking face. So a whirlpool, you're right, could be a toilet, though I would have to ask Kendall about the historical.
Had they been invented yet, right?
Right. But that's good. It's always good to try.
We're on the cusp. Yes.
On the
But
cusp?
not quite yet with the water closet. But that's coming in the next decade.
Okay, good. I look forward to it. What did you make of line 17, everybody? I love that line.
Well, it's a very, Hail Mary.
It is. It's Hail Mary, full of grace.
Yeah. But it's
Portion-
shameful, Jenny. And it has the same lyricism, but it's inverted.
Okay, so there you have her, right? Like one line. That's Jenny. That's Jenny, the prostitute, from the speaker's point of view. And the rest of the lines support that, because you see the beautiful woman who dances, whose hair is gold incomparable, looks like fresh flowers. And yet, line 12, you have love's exuberant hotbed. Well, it's interesting. Flower in line 11, flower in line 13, but this hotbed is not gardening. Right? Okay.
Does it mean that she has an innocence about her that is hiding her true calling or her what she does for a living?
Yeah, Jen, I wonder too whether or not, I mean, yeah, she's a prostitute, but there is a lot of sympathy here. And at the end, it's almost like there's this halting admission of who she really is, right? So I guess my question is, well, is she kind of a beautiful soul who has to do what she does, and therefore has these two sides, or is she one who's been disguising it from the beginning?
Or is it the poet who's conflicted?
That's right. That's
Oh,
right.
it's definitely
Writer.
conflicted.
He's definitely conflicted. Yeah, the speaker is definitely.
But even when he says fresh flower, it's scarce touched with signs that tell. Like you can barely see it. It's kind of like, I love you slightly less than I used to. It's that kind of faint praise
Yeah.
thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Doc, keep an eye on your time.
Yeah. Also, off topic, but
Yes.
I watch John Oliver, and the episode that just came out recently was about sex workers and the humanization of sex workers. So extremely timely for our discussion.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay, we're going to, and thank God for Kendall to keep me, working rapidly. Let's go to the marriage vow, which is a very interesting. But I tried to choose poems that show very different views of women, not necessarily ones that were even. Well, they obviously existed at the time, but they weren't necessarily the most popular or accepted views of women. So Letitia Elizabeth Landon was quite a character. She was wildly popular in her day. She influenced, because she was quite an experimenter with meter and rhyme, so she influenced both Elizabeth Barrett Browning and her hubby, Robert Browning. But she lost favor in the later Victorian times because people felt that her lifestyle was immoral. And, it might have been. It might have been. But she was a poet, a novelist. She was the chief reviewer for the Literary Gazette. And when her father died, when she was only 22, she supported the family through her writing, which is certainly an unusual role for a woman to take, during the Victorian period. She did what were called poetical illustrations. She would take famous paintings and then write poems about them. Fun fact, she was engaged to John Forster, who was Dickens' best friend and first biographer. But he had heard lots of rumors about her, perhaps her sexual dalliances. So he asked her to refute them. And she said, "No, you go ahead, knock yourself out." That is not a quote from her. But he did. He investigated her affairs, her relationships, whatever. And then he was satisfied. He thought that it was okay. She made the cut with him. And then she dumped him, saying that she couldn't marry a man who mistrusted her, which I think is so cool. So anyway, this was written in 1837. This is the closest to the publication date of Oliver that I found any of the poems. Okay, I'm going to read it just because we're trying to get things done. The altar, the marriage vow. The altar, 'tis of death, for there are laid the sacrifice of all youth's sweetest hopes. It is a dreadful thing for woman's lip to swear the heart away. Yet know that heart annuls the vow while speaking and shrinks back from the dark future that it dares not face. The service read above the open grave is far less terrible than that which seals the vow that binds the victim, not the will. For in the grave is rest. I mean, this is not nearly as complex as Rossetti's, but
The first feminist manifesto.
well, it certainly is. It certainly is the first feminist manifesto. Yeah, and and wonderful, wonderful diction, wonderful choice of words. Alter, annuls, right? And those last lines, wow. It's almost to be better off dead, right? I mean, it's really quite and this is one of the reasons why Victorians did not, or some Victorians, particularly towards the end of the century, did not like her. They thought this was inappropriate. It sort of flew in the face of the angel in the house. And yet, it was written well before Rossetti was writing Goblin Market. So it's kind of cool.
It reminds me.
Yes, Liz.
I'm sorry, I'm just gonna jump in here. Remember the
Yeah.
poem that we read in the second week that had the marriage hearse in it?
Yes, yeah.
It sort of reminded me of that and how they were saying that marriage is like a death sentence. It's
Yeah, and
and at that time, hopefully not
Right.
now. Yeah.
Oh. He's a cutie, isn't he? Okay, so now we're going to go to one last poem, and then we're going to spend the rest of the time briefly looking at. I understand.
Bevan would like to read this poem.
Oh, good for you, Bevan.
Can I?
You go, guy.
How we trying? All right. So this is excerpts from Song of the Shirt. With fingers weary and worn, with eyelids heavy and red, a woman sat in unwomanly rags, plying her needle and thread. Stitch, 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 in poverty, hunger, and dirt. And still, with a voice of dolorous pitch, she sang the song of the shirt. Work, 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 till the brain begins to swim. Work, 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 till the eyes are heavy and dim. Seam and gusset and band, band and gusset and seam, till over the buttons I fall asleep and sew them on in a dream. Oh, men with sisters dear, oh, men with mothers and wives, it is not linen you're wearing out, but human creatures' lives. Stitch, 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 in poverty, hunger, and dirt. Sewing at once with a double thread, a shroud as well as a shirt. Oh, but to breathe the breath of the cowslip and primrose sweet, with the sky above my head and the grass beneath my feet. For only one short hour to feel as I used to feel before I knew the woes of want and the walk that costs a meal. Would that its tone could reach the rich. She sang this song of the shirt.
Nicely done.
Thank you.
Nicely done. Okay. This guy, Thomas Hood, was actually writing about, this is a real person who was the person spoken of in the poem. A woman named Mrs. Biddle. There's no record of her first name. She was a widow and seamstress. And at the time, the seamstresses would work at home, but they had an employer who would provide them with the cloth. They would have to pay £2 just to get the cloth. And then it would be partially, then it would be reimbursed after they had made the clothing. Well, she ended up, her children were starving, so she started to pawn what she had made, and therefore she fell in debt to her employer, and she died a young death. And this is one of there are a number of poets called, who were the working women poets of the time, and they particularly gained prominence after the time of Oliver Twist. So that's why I didn't include one of them. But this one was written right, just in the zone, Would anyone like to make a comment about it? I'll throw a question. How does repetition work?
I think he uses repetition beautifully because he uses it with language, and you can picture, the work of a seamstress, especially this one, is just so tedious. It's just her work is repetition, her life is repetition. So the stitch, 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 and the work, 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 and the fact that he repeats that several times, that's her I mean, her mind numbing days, it's just the same thing over and over again.
Excellent. And look at lines 13 and 14. Seam and gusset and band, band and gusset and seam. It just
Circular.
never stops. It never stops. And then, of course, the great line about I'll make a shirt, but I make a shroud too. You know, there's that that kind of image. Okay. Other comments of this poem, and then we're going to do a quick switch to Dickens. Okay. Well, that gives you a sort of sense of the kind of stuff that was being written at the time. Okay. Much more, there was much more of a feminist slant in the later Victorian period. Okay. All right. Let's go to that first segment of pages that I mentioned, the Nancy and Rose scenes. Kendall gave a nice introduction to them, but these would be around page 328-ish. And for the next few pages. So here we have Nancy and Rose together. Nancy, you know, it's no surprise. She's viewed as by far the richest character, you know, in terms of the depth of her characterization in the novel. The other women, while serving their purpose, including Rose, I mean, some critics just, you know, go to town on Rose. They call her vapid. Okay, so let's take a look at page 329 at what Sykes says about Nancy. Take a look at that page. You see anything that is worthy of note?
Well, he's suspicious she's going to rat him out. And he's like, no, you wouldn't do that. Or I would have killed you like 3 months ago.
Yeah, yeah. But there ain't a stauncher, harder girl, is there?
True. Stauncher hearted.
Yeah. And he says later, come and sit aside of me and put on your own face, or I'll alter it so that you won't know it again when you do want it. He's complaining that she's not looking very well. Okay. And he's sick. She's tending to him. She's nursing him. And he's bitching and moaning about it. But look what she does. She obeyed. And I think that word obeyed is really, really important. Okay. Because she does obey Bill in many respects, in terms of obeying the kind of connection and well, the kind of faithfulness that she has for him. Okay, so when she meets Rose on pages 332 and 333, take a look at those pages. How do you see the two Dickens character creating this great contrast of character?
In the middle of page 332, the
Mm-hmm.
girl's life had been squandered in the streets and the most noisome of the stews and dens of London, but there was something of the woman's original nature left in her still. And when she heard a light step approaching the door opposite to that by which she had entered, and thought of the wide contrast which a small room would be in another moment contained, she felt burdened with the sense of her own deep shame and shrunk as though she could scarcely bear the presence of her with whom she had sought this interview.
Okay.
And you kind of wonder, what was Nancy's background before she
well, in these pages, she does give us, I mean, it's never specific. And, you know, the thing is, and it was only in the introduction, I think, or the preface to one of the first editions of the book, that she was called a prostitute by Dickens.
1841.
Okay, thank you, sir. However, nowhere in the text is she called a prostitute.
but she's worked for Fagin since she was Oliver's age.
Right, right. But we don't know
Yeah.
that, is Bill her pimp as well as her lover? Is Fagin the pimp master and the handkerchief stealer master too? We don't know. I mean, that's a good point. What do we know about her? We know that this has been her life, right? Can you find anything in these pages which essentially where she looks to her past life?
Mostly she just says like, thank God you haven't had my past life. And she doesn't really talk much about what that is.
Yeah, on page 334, thank heaven upon your knees, dear lady, cried the girl, that you had friends to care for and keep you in your childhood, and that you were never in the midst of cold and hunger and riot and drunkenness, and something worse than all, as I have been from my cradle, I may use the word, for the alley and the gutter were mine, as they will be my deathbed. There you have it. So, here you have Nancy, and she is, through the description, we looked at that the last time, she's very full-bodied. And Kendall had an important quote from earlier in the novel in one of his slides, where we have the description of Rose as being very light, very ethereal, almost not human, too perfect. And it might have to do with his autobiographical concerns, but there's that great contrast, okay, the physical reality of the two of them. But what do we find out about Rose in these pages? So, well, I mean, we'll just stay with this. What do we find here about this great contrast? Why do some people say, Nancy is real? There's something real about her. Rose is totally unreal.
Well, if you read just this interaction,
Yeah.
Nancy is very passionate, very what you call alive, right?
Yes.
And Rose is very, oh, you distress me. I can't imagine this. Like, oh dear, and she involuntarily falling. Like, all her adjectives are very helpless.
Absolutely. She's totally passive. And
she's not in charge of her own actions, even just in a discussion.
Except in other places, we hear that she figures out not to involve the doctor in her plotting. Rose is a very astute young woman, and I sort of saw her as sitting back a little bit and letting Nancy, say her piece, as opposed to in other places, you see she's manipulating the different people in her environment.
I'm going to throw a piece in here.
Yeah.
I think Dickens is also illustrating Rose as what a middle-class woman should be.
Yes. I mean, she's the angel in the house.
Yeah.
She's the angel in the house. And I think I get what you said. But the way she's described constantly, the kind tone of this answer, the sweet voice, the gentle manner, the absence of any accent of haughtiness or displeasure took the girl completely by surprise, and she burst into tears. Now, I mean, that's kind of like, okay, she's perfect. But there is that interesting part about her past that we do discover. The idea that, well, Okay, so she's really Miss Maley's ward. 1 minute or shut up. Okay, she's Miss Maley's ward. She doesn't want to sully the life of Harry. Why is that? Well, because she's worried about her past. Because she's not ideal. And that's what I think separates her from, like being a totally flat character. She has that about her. She may act a particular way, which would be the perfect Victorian woman. However, and she might be the total angel in the house after she gets married to Harry. But there's always that part of her that links her to Nancy. And I think that creates more richness in their relationship, which I think is very, very real. Okay, I'll shut up.
Joan, I want to apologize if I stepped on your words. You were spot on too. I think your comments were good. So sorry if I jumped in on the end there. Doc, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all. Great to see you guys.
Hope you all had a good time. We got 2 more to go. But then we got another whole course next year, second half. So thanks for joining in. Hope to see you next time. Go see what the president has to say.
Yeah. Take care.
Thank you.
Melissa,
Thank you very
very much.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody.